The small county courthouse stood quietly on that crisp autumn morning, its weathered brick walls having witnessed countless stories of justice and redemption over the years. But on this particular Tuesday, something extraordinary was about to unfold within its chambers, something that would touch the hearts of everyone present and challenge their preconceptions about justice, compassion, and the wisdom that sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Inside Courtroom 3, the morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. The usual buzz of whispered conversations and shuffling papers filled the air as court officials prepared for what appeared to be a routine juvenile case. However, this case was anything but routine. A small figure sat at the defendant's table, his feet barely touching the floor. At just 10 years old, he was one of the youngest individuals ever to appear before Judge Richard Thompson in his 20-year career on the bench. The boy wore his best clothes, a slightly oversized white shirt tucked into khaki pants that had been carefully pressed by his grandmother the night before. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his eyes remained fixed on his hands, which nervously twisted a tissue in his lap. Behind him sat his grandmother, Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her 60s who had been raising him since he was 3. Her face showed the weight of worry that had aged her beyond her years, but her posture remained dignified as she watched over her grandson. They were alone on their side of the courtroom, no lawyer, no other family members, just a grandmother and her grandson facing what felt like the world. The case seemed straightforward on paper. The boy had been caught stealing food from a local grocery store, not once, but 3 times in the past month. The store owner, Mr. Patterson, had finally called the police after the 3rd incident, feeling he had no choice left. He sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, his expression a mixture of duty and discomfort at having to press charges against someone so young. As Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, everyone rose. His reputation preceded him, firm but fair, known for his no-nonsense approach to justice. He settled into his chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and began reviewing the case file before him. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy with anticipation. "Young man," the judge's voice carried across the room, "please stand." The boy rose slowly, his grandmother's hand gently touching his shoulder in support. His small frame seemed even tinier against the massive wooden podium before him. "Can you tell me why you're here today?" Judge Thompson's voice was neutral, neither harsh nor gentle. The boy's voice quivered as he began to speak, barely audible at first. "Yes, sir. I stole food from Mr. Patterson's store." "And you did this 3 times, correct?" "Yes, sir." The judge leaned forward slightly. "That's a serious matter. Would you like to explain why?" What happened next would change the atmosphere in that courtroom forever. The boy's story began to unfold, not in a rehearsed or manipulative way, but with the raw honesty that only a child can deliver. He spoke of his grandmother working 2 jobs, one as a morning cleaner at the local hospital and another as an evening dishwasher at a restaurant. He described how she had recently lost her 3rd job when the small laundromat where she worked weekends had closed down. Their carefully managed budget had suddenly collapsed, but his grandmother was too proud to ask for help. "I saw her crying one night," the boy continued, his voice growing stronger with concern for his grandmother. "She thought I was asleep, but I heard her counting coins at the kitchen table. She hadn't eaten dinner that night, she said she wasn't hungry, but I knew she was giving me her food." The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. Mr. Patterson, the store owner, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The first time I took food, it was bread and cheese for her sandwich. She always makes me sandwiches, but that week she said she forgot to buy bread for herself. The second time was when her arthritis medicine made her sick, and I remembered she needed crackers with her pills. The third time." He paused, swallowing hard. "The third time was because I saw her looking at the vitamins she always buys me, but she put them back because they cost too much now." Judge Thompson removed his glasses, his usual stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. "And did you tell your grandmother about taking these items?" "No, sir," the boy replied, tears welling in his eyes. "I knew it was wrong to steal. She always taught me that. But I thought being a bad grandson who lets his grandmother go hungry was worse." Mrs. Chen's quiet sobs could now be heard in the courtroom. She reached for her grandson, but the court officer gently indicated she should remain seated. The judge sat back, studying the boy before him. In his years on the bench, he had heard countless explanations and excuses, but there was something different about this case. The boy hadn't tried to deny his actions or minimize their seriousness. Instead, he had offered a window into a world where impossible choices faced not hardened criminals, but a child trying to care for the only parent he had ever known. Mr. Patterson suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" The judge nodded, and the store owner cleared his throat. "I didn't know. I mean, if I had understood the situation." He looked at the boy and his grandmother. "I would have helped. My own mother raised me alone. I should have seen the signs." The morning sun had climbed higher now, its light filling the courtroom with an almost ethereal glow. Judge Thompson looked at his watch, then at the papers before him, then back at the small figure standing at the podium. The next few moments would prove that sometimes justice wears many faces, and wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. The tension in Courtroom 3 had transformed into something else entirely, a shared understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between judgment and compassion. Judge Thompson's years of experience had taught him to read between the lines of human behavior, and what he saw before him was not a case of juvenile delinquency, but a story of love, desperation, and sacrifice. "Mrs. Chen," the judge's voice was gentler now. "Would you please approach the bench?" The elderly woman rose slowly, her arthritis making each step deliberate. Her grandson watched with worried eyes as she made her way forward, her dignity intact despite the tears that had left trails on her cheeks. She stood beside her grandson, unconsciously reaching for his hand. "How long have you been raising your grandson?" Judge Thompson asked. 7 years, Your Honor," she replied, her accent thick but clear. "Since he was 3. His mother, my daughter." She paused, gathering strength. She passed away from cancer. His father was never in the picture. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "And you work 2 jobs now?" "Yes, Your Honor. I used to have 3, but the laundromat." Her voice trailed off, and she straightened her shoulders. "We manage. We always manage. Have you sought assistance?" "There are programs." "I tried, Your Honor." Mrs. Chen's voice carried a note of frustration. "The waiting lists are very long. And some places, they need so many papers, documents I don't have anymore. They were lost when we had to move to a smaller apartment last year." The boy looked up at his grandmother, surprise crossing his face. He hadn't known about the papers, about her trying to get help. She had shielded him from so much, just as he had tried to shield her in his own way. Judge Thompson removed his glasses again, cleaning them slowly with a cloth from his pocket. This deliberate action gave everyone in the courtroom a moment to absorb what they were witnessing. When he replaced them, his decision seemed to have crystallized. "Mr. Patterson," he called. "Would you join us at the bench?" The store owner stepped forward, his earlier anger completely dissolved. He kept glancing at the boy and his grandmother with what could only be described as regret. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson began before being asked anything, "I'd like to withdraw the charges." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge held up his hand for silence. "While I appreciate that sentiment, Mr. Patterson, the law requires us to address what has happened. However," he paused meaningfully, "how would you feel about a different kind of resolution?" The store owner nodded eagerly. "Anything, Your Honor. I never wanted. I mean, if I had known. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, the judge said, his words carrying weight beyond this specific case. But it's never too late to open our eyes. He turned to the court clerk. Please contact Mrs. Reynolds from Social Services. She should be in the building today. The clerk nodded and hurried out. While they waited, Judge Thompson addressed the boy directly. Young man, what you did was wrong. Taking things that don't belong to you is never the right answer, no matter how good your intentions. Do you understand that? The boy nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. I know it was wrong. However, the judge continued, your actions, while misguided, show a deep love and concern for your grandmother. That speaks to your character. Sometimes good people make bad choices when they feel they have no other options. The trick is to help people find better options. Mrs. Reynolds entered the courtroom, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She carried a tablet and what appeared to be several forms. The judge briefly explained the situation to her in hushed tones. Now, Judge Thompson addressed everyone present, here's what we're going to do. Mrs. Reynolds will help Mrs. Chen navigate the assistance program she qualifies for, and I suspect there are several. She'll also help locate or replace any missing documentation. He turned to Mr. Patterson. Would you be willing to be part of a different kind of rehabilitation program? Of course, Your Honor, the store owner replied quickly. Instead of pursuing charges, I propose we set up a program where this young man works at your store, properly employed, with proper pay, of course, during appropriate hours that don't interfere with his schooling. He can learn about business, responsibility, and the right way to help his family. Mr. Patterson's face lit up. I've been looking for help with stocking and inventory on weekends. And he glanced at Mrs. Chen, we have a small break room with a microwave. Employee meals are included in every shift. The implications of that last part weren't lost on anyone. The boy's eyes widened with hope, while his grandmother pressed her hands together in grateful acknowledgement. Judge Thompson wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm going to personally contact the community health center about Mrs. Chen's arthritis medication. They have a program for seniors that I believe she would qualify for. He leaned forward, looking directly at the boy. But this all comes with conditions. First, you must maintain your grades in school. Second, you must write a letter of apology to Mr. Patterson, not for being concerned about your grandmother, but for choosing the wrong way to help. And third, you must promise that if you ever feel this desperate again, you'll talk to an adult who can help. There are always better solutions than breaking the law. Do you accept these terms? The boy stood straighter, his voice clear and steady for the first time that day. Yes, Your Honor. I promise. The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a simple case of juvenile theft had become something else entirely, a lesson in community, compassion, and the importance of reaching out for help. The morning sun now filled the room completely, as if nature itself was approving of what had transpired. News of what had transpired in Courtroom 3 spread quickly through the small county courthouse, then rippled outward into the community like waves in a pond. It wasn't just the unusual nature of the case or the judge's creative solution that caught people's attention, it was the raw humanity of the situation that touched something deep within everyone who heard the story. As Mrs. Reynolds helped Mrs. Chen fill out the necessary paperwork in a quiet corner of the courthouse, other court employees began to gather. A bailiff brought them cups of hot tea. The court stenographer offered to translate some of the more complex documents, mentioning that her own parents had faced similar challenges when they first arrived in the country. Even the usually stern-faced security guard shared half of his lunch with the boy, who hadn't eaten breakfast that morning due to nerves. Mr. Patterson pulled Judge Thompson aside, speaking in low, earnest tones. Your Honor, I've been thinking. That empty storage room above my store, it's not much, but with some work, it could be converted into a small apartment. The rent would be reasonable, and it's closer to both Mrs. Chen's jobs. The judge nodded approvingly. That's very generous of you. But let's make sure everything is properly documented and up to code. We don't want to solve one problem by creating another. Meanwhile, the boy sat quietly, watching the adults around him work to rebuild the world he and his grandmother had thought was crumbling. He pulled out a worn notebook from his backpack and began to write his letter of apology to Mr. Patterson, his young face serious with concentration. "Dear Mr. Patterson," he wrote, carefully forming each letter. "I am very sorry for stealing from your store. My grandmother taught me that honest people work hard for what they need, and I forgot that when I was scared. I should have trusted that there were good people who would help if we asked." As he wrote, a young clerk who had been watching the proceedings all morning approached Judge Thompson. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "I volunteer at the food bank on weekends. We've been trying to start a program to identify families in need before they reach a crisis point, but we didn't know how to connect with them. Maybe this case could help us find a way." The judge's eyes lit up with interest. Sometimes it takes one story to open our eyes to a larger truth. Set up a meeting with the food bank director for next week. And he glanced at Mrs. Chen, who was still working with Mrs. Reynolds, make sure they know about cultural dietary preferences. Food assistants should respect people's traditions. The morning had stretched into afternoon, but no one seemed eager to leave. The usual parade of cases had been temporarily postponed, with other judges handling the most urgent matters. Something more important was taking shape in Courtroom 3, something that went beyond one case or one family. Mrs. Chen finished the last of the paperwork, her hands trembling slightly as Mrs. Reynolds explained what would happen next. "The emergency food assistance can start immediately," the social worker explained. "The medical coverage will take a few days to process, but I've already called the community health center. They've agreed to provide your arthritis medication under their charity care program until the coverage kicks in." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the tears of shame and worry she had shed earlier. "I don't know how to thank everyone," she said softly. "I was so afraid when we came here this morning. I thought..." She looked at her grandson, who was still bent over his letter. "I thought I might lose him." Judge Thompson overheard her words and approached. "Mrs. Chen, what happened here today isn't just about help being given. It's about a community remembering what it means to be a community. Your grandson's actions, while wrong, have reminded us all of something important, that we're responsible for each other." The boy looked up from his letter, listening intently as the judge continued. "Sometimes it takes the wisdom of a child to show us where we've failed as adults. Your grandson stole food not for himself, but to help you. While we cannot condone his methods, his heart showed us where our system had gaps that left a grandmother choosing between medicine and food, and a child feeling so desperate he would risk his future to help." The judge's words seemed to fill the courtroom with a weight that everyone felt. Several people wiped their eyes discreetly, and Mr. Patterson had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. "Starting Saturday," Mr. Patterson said, clearing his throat, "we'll begin training you on the cash register and inventory system." He smiled at the boy. "And I think the first project will be setting up a small section for basic medicines and vitamins. We should have done that years ago." The court clerk who had mentioned the food bank returned with more news. "The bank next door heard what happened. They're offering to help Mrs. Chen set up a proper checking account, and they have a program that matches savings for education." She stopped, realizing she was getting ahead of herself, but the excitement in her voice was genuine. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, something remarkable had taken shape. What had begun as a simple case of juvenile theft had transformed into a moment of community awakening. The law had been upheld, but it had been tempered with wisdom and compassion. Justice had been served, but in a way that built up rather than tore down. The boy finally finished his letter and handed it to Mr. Patterson, who read it with careful attention. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "This is a very good letter," he said. "And I accept your apology. But more than that, I want you to know that I'm looking forward to working with you. Sometimes the best employees are the ones who already care about helping others, they just need to learn the right way to do it." As the extraordinary day in Courtroom 3 began drawing to a close, Judge Thompson realized that something unprecedented was happening. The usual barriers between court officials, law enforcement, and citizens had dissolved into a collaborative effort that promised to extend far beyond this single case. The local newspaper reporter, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the proceedings, approached the judge. "Your Honor, would Mrs. Chen and her grandson be willing to share their story? Not to sensationalize it, but to help other families who might be struggling in silence?" The judge glanced at Mrs. Chen, who had been listening to Mr. Patterson explain the details of her grandson's future work schedule. She looked up and nodded slowly. "If it helps other families not feel ashamed to ask for help, yes, we will share our story." The boy, who had been relatively quiet since finishing his letter, suddenly spoke up. "Could we also tell people about all the help we're getting? So they know there are good people who want to help?" His simple question brought warm smiles to everyone's faces. The reporter knelt down to meet his eyes. "That's exactly what we want to tell people. Sometimes the most important stories are about how communities come together to help each other." Meanwhile, Mrs. Reynolds had been making calls from her cell phone in the corner. She returned to the group with even more news. The community health center is interested in setting up a monthly clinic at Mr. Patterson's store, right after the food bank distribution days. They say it makes sense to offer health screenings where people are already gathering. Mr. Patterson's eyes lit up. "We could use the community room behind the store. It's been sitting empty since the senior center moved to their new building. With some cleaning and basic furniture." The judge held up his hand, though his expression was pleased. "Let's make sure we do everything properly. We'll need to check zoning regulations, get proper permits." He turned to his clerk. "Could you contact the city planning office? See if they can expedite the process given the circumstances?" The clerk was already pulling out her phone. "The planning director's nephew volunteers at the food bank. I'm sure she'll want to help." As these plans were being made, the boy tugged gently on his grandmother's sleeve. She leaned down, and he whispered something in her ear. Mrs. Chen straightened up, her eyes glistening. "My grandson wants to know." She paused, collecting herself. "He wants to know if he can use some of his first paycheck to buy vitamins for other kids whose families might be struggling." The silence that followed was profound. Even Judge Thompson had to remove his glasses and wipe his eyes, not bothering to hide the gesture this time. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Tell you what, for every vitamin bottle you buy for others, I'll match it. We'll set up a special section in the store. People can take what they need and pay what they can, even if it's just a quarter." The court stenographer, who had been diligently recording everything all day, finally set down her equipment. "My sister teaches at the elementary school," she said. "She's always talking about kids who can't focus because they're hungry or not feeling well. Maybe we could connect the school with these resources?" Judge Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "We're seeing something important take shape here. It's not just about helping one family, it's about creating a network of support that catches people before they fall into crisis." He turned to address everyone in the courtroom. "What began this morning as a seemingly simple case has revealed something profound about our community. We've seen how quickly things can turn around when we stop seeing each other as cases or statistics and start seeing each other as neighbors." The boy, who had been listening intently, raised his hand as if he were in school. The judge smiled and nodded at him. "Sir," the boy began, his voice stronger now than it had been all day, "in school we learned about dominoes, how when one falls, it can make others fall too. But can't it work the other way? Can't one good thing make other good things happen? The wisdom in his question left the adults momentarily speechless. It was the reporter who finally responded, already scribbling the quote in her notebook. That's exactly what's happening here. One act of compassion is leading to another, and another. Mrs. Reynolds, who had seen countless cases of families in crisis throughout her career, spoke up. We often talk about cycles of poverty or cycles of violence. But today, we're creating a different kind of cycle, a cycle of community care. As the afternoon continued, more plans took shape. The bank representative arrived with forms for an education savings account, explaining how the matching program would work. The food bank coordinator came by after hearing about the case, already mapping out how to better reach families in need. Mr. Patterson sat down with Mrs. Chen and her grandson, sketching out a work schedule that would allow the boy plenty of time for homework and rest. We'll start with basic training this Saturday, he explained. But I want you to know something important. You're not just going to be a worker in my store. You're going to be part of creating something new, something that could help a lot of people. The boy's eyes widened at this responsibility, but instead of fear, there was determination in his expression. His grandmother squeezed his hand proudly. Judge Thompson watched all of this unfold from his bench, making occasional notes in his journal. In 20 years of serving on the bench, he had handed down thousands of sentences, but few had felt as meaningful as today's resolution. He wrote down the boy's question about dominoes, underlining it twice. Sometimes, he wrote, the most profound changes in a community don't come from top-down decisions or grand initiatives. They come from moments like this, when one person's story opens our eyes to what we should have seen all along, and when compassion and justice find a way to work hand in hand. The following Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, marking the beginning of what would become a remarkable transformation in the community. Mr. Patterson's store, usually quiet at this early hour, was already bustling with activity. The boy had arrived early for his first day of work, wearing a crisp new name tag and an expression of determined responsibility. Mr. Patterson had spent the week reorganizing the store's layout to accommodate the new community health section. The previously cluttered back room had been cleared out, cleaned, and set up with folding tables and chairs. Through the large windows, early morning shoppers could see Mrs. Chen helping to arrange pamphlets about community resources on a newly installed bulletin board. First lesson of retail, Mr. Patterson explained to his young employee, is that a store can be more than just a place to buy things. It can be a place where the community comes together. The boy nodded earnestly, taking mental notes as Mr. Patterson showed him how to properly stock shelves and rotate products. His grandmother watched from nearby, pretending to organize canned goods while actually wiping away proud tears when she thought no one was looking. News of what had happened in the courtroom had spread through the neighborhood, and throughout the morning, people kept dropping by. Some came with donations for the new community health section. Others brought skills and offers to help. A retired nurse volunteered to assist during the upcoming health screening days, while a local carpenter offered to build proper shelving for the new community space. Around mid-morning, Judge Thompson stopped by, out of his robes and dressed casually. He watched the boy carefully counting inventory, double-checking his work with a dedication that made the judge smile. "How's our newest employee doing?" he asked Mr. Patterson quietly. "Better than some adults I've hired," Mr. Patterson replied. "He hasn't just been learning the work, he's been coming up with ideas. Wait till you see what he suggested for the vitamin display." The judge followed Mr. Patterson to a newly set-up section of the store. There, clearly labeled shelves held various vitamins and basic medical supplies. But what caught his attention was the unique pricing system. Each item had two prices listed, regular and pay what you can. It was his idea, Mr. Patterson explained, nodding toward the boy. He said some people might feel bad taking things for free, but they'd feel okay paying what they could manage. Even if it's just a quarter, he said it helps people keep their dignity. Judge Thompson shook his head in amazement. The wisdom of children, he murmured. Sometimes they see solutions we adults overlook because we're too caught up in conventional thinking. As they talked, Mrs. Reynolds from Social Services arrived with exciting news. The Community Health Center had fast-tracked their proposal for the monthly clinic, and the city had granted temporary approval for the space while the permanent permits were being processed. The mayor's office called this morning, she shared. They want to use this as a pilot program. If it works here, they're considering setting up similar arrangements in other neighborhoods. The boy, who had been carefully arranging a display of multivitamins nearby, looked up with interest. Does that mean other kids won't have to worry about their grandparents not having medicine? Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. That's exactly what it means. And it's happening because you helped us all see what needed to change. Throughout the day, more community members stopped by to see the changes taking place. The local newspaper's story had run that morning, and its impact was immediate. People who read about Mrs. Chen's struggle and her grandson's desperate attempt to help her were deeply moved, but more importantly, they were inspired to action. A local doctor arrived around lunchtime, offering to volunteer at the monthly clinics. A group of high school students came by, asking if they could help set up a tutoring program in the community space during after-school hours. Each visitor brought not just offers of help, but a growing sense that something special was happening in their community. The boy's first paycheck wouldn't come for 2 weeks, but Mr. Patterson had already set aside a special shelf in the vitamin section, labeled Kids Helping Kids. Several local families had made donations to start the program, ensuring that any child who needed vitamins would have access to them. During his lunch break, the boy sat with his grandmother in the newly organized break room. She had brought a homemade lunch for both of them, the first time in weeks she hadn't had to worry about having enough food for 2 meals. "Are you proud of me, grandmother?" he asked quietly, between bites of her carefully prepared meal. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table to hold his hand. "I have always been proud of you," she said softly. "But now I am proud in a different way. You made a mistake, but from that mistake, you helped create something beautiful." Judge Thompson, who had stayed longer than he'd planned, overheard their conversation from nearby. He made a note in the small notebook he always carried, "Justice served through transformation rather than punishment." Below it, he added, "One child's love for his grandmother may have changed our entire approach to community welfare." As the afternoon progressed, Mr. Patterson gathered everyone present for a small ceremony. He unveiled a new sign above the community space entrance, "The Bridge, where neighbors help neighbors." Beneath it was a smaller plaque that read, "Inspired by a boy who taught us to see with our hearts." The boy stared at the plaque, his eyes wide. "But I did something wrong," he whispered to Judge Thompson, who had come to stand beside him. The judge placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, young man, our mistakes can lead us to our greatest opportunities to do good. What matters is not just that we learn from them, but that we use them to help others. And that's exactly what you've done." The local news crew arrived later that afternoon to document the community's transformation. As they set up their cameras, they captured something remarkable, not just the physical changes to the store or the new programs being established, but the subtle shift in how people interacted with each other. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now engaged in animated conversations about how they could contribute to the growing initiative. 1 month had passed since that transformative day in Courtroom 3, and the changes in the community were nothing short of remarkable. The local newspaper had scheduled a follow-up story, and their reporter sat in Mr. Patterson's store, watching the bustling Saturday morning activity with amazement. The once simple grocery store had become the heart of the neighborhood. The community space, now officially named The Bridge, was hosting its first monthly health clinic. A line of people waited patiently while volunteer nurses conducted basic health screenings. The atmosphere wasn't one of charity, but of neighbors helping neighbors, exactly as the sign promised. The boy, now a familiar face to regular customers, moved confidently through the store in his neatly pressed work shirt. He had just finished restocking the vitamin section, which had become something of a local phenomenon. The Kids Helping Kids shelf was regularly replenished through a combination of his own contributions from his paycheck and community donations. "Remember when you first started?" Mr. Patterson asked him, reviewing the inventory sheet the boy had carefully completed. "You were so nervous about making mistakes. Now look at you, training our new volunteers." Indeed, the boy's success had inspired Mr. Patterson to start a youth employment program. 3 other young people from struggling families had joined the team, each earning fair wages while learning valuable skills. More importantly, they were learning the same lesson that had transformed their first young employee, that asking for help and helping others were 2 sides of the same coin. Mrs. Chen, who had finally received proper treatment for her arthritis, spent her free mornings helping other elderly residents navigate assistance programs. Her experience had made her an invaluable bridge between the community and various social services. She no longer worked 3 jobs. The combination of proper assistance and her grandson's contribution had stabilized their finances. "Last month, I was ashamed to ask for help," she told a nervous elderly man who had come to the health clinic. "Now I understand, sharing our struggles allows others to share their strength." Judge Thompson had become a regular visitor to the bridge, often spending his Saturday mornings there before heading to his weekend duties at the courthouse. Today, he sat with a cup of coffee, observing the profound impact of his unconventional sentence. The local bank had set up a small table near the community space, offering financial literacy workshops and information about their matched savings program. Already, several families had opened education savings accounts similar to the one created for the boy. "Your Honor," the reporter asked, notebook in hand, "did you have any idea that your decision that day would lead to all this?" The judge smiled, watching as the boy helped an elderly woman find the right vitamins for her grandchildren. "Justice comes in many forms," he replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most powerful form is the kind that builds rather than punishes, that transforms rather than condemns." A small commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A woman had entered the store, clearly distressed, holding the hand of a young teenager. The boy, recognizing the look of shame and desperation he had once worn himself, immediately approached them. "Can I help you find something?" he asked gently. The woman hesitated, but her son spoke up. We don't have enough for food this week. Dad lost his job, and..." Before he could finish, the boy was already leading them to the bridge's intake desk, where Mrs. Reynolds had set up a permanent office. "It's okay," he assured them. "Everyone here understands. Let me show you how we can help." Judge Thompson watched this interaction with profound satisfaction. "You see," he told the reporter, "that boy isn't just working in a store. He's becoming a leader in his own right. He's showing others that there's no shame in reaching out for help." The reporter nodded, scribbling rapidly. "It's amazing how one case, one decision, could create such change." "It wasn't just the decision," the judge corrected. "It was the community's response to it. Everyone here had the capacity to help, they just needed to be reminded of their connection to each other." As if to emphasize his point, Mr. Patterson was already arranging for the new family to receive emergency food assistance. The bank representative had overheard their situation and was preparing information about job search resources and temporary financial assistance programs. The boy's grandmother, who had been organizing donation records nearby, approached the distressed mother. "Come," she said softly, "let me show you how strong this community can be when we work together." Later that afternoon, during his break, the boy sat with Judge Thompson. He had grown more confident over the past month, but still maintained the thoughtful demeanor that had touched so many hearts in the courtroom. "Sir," he asked, "do you remember when I talked about dominoes falling in a good way?" The judge nodded, recalling the profound wisdom in that simple question. "Well, I've been keeping track," the boy continued, pulling out a small notebook. "Every person who comes in for help ends up helping someone else later. It's like Like the dominoes never stop falling, but they're building things up instead of knocking them down. Judge Thompson leaned forward, intrigued. Show me what you mean. The boy opened his notebook, revealing carefully documented instances of community connection. The elderly man Mrs. Chen had helped last week was now volunteering as a math tutor. A mother who had received emergency food assistance had started a clothing exchange program. The carpenter who had built the shelves was teaching weekend workshops on basic home repairs. You've created quite a record here, the judge observed, genuinely impressed. I want to remember everything, the boy explained. So if someone else makes a mistake like I did, I can show them that good things can come after bad choices if you learn from them and try to help others. 3 months after that fateful day in Courtroom 3, the City Council called a special evening session. The council chambers were packed with community members, including Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Chen, her grandson, Judge Thompson, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the transformation that began with one small case. The mayor stood at the podium, holding a document that would officially recognize the bridge as a model for community support centers across the city. But before the formal proceedings began, she asked the boy to come forward and share his story. He walked to the podium, no longer the frightened child who had stood before Judge Thompson months ago. His work uniform was neat, his posture confident, though his eyes still held that same thoughtful expression that had touched so many hearts. 3 months ago, he began, his clear voice carrying through the chamber, I made a mistake because I didn't know how to ask for help. I thought I had to choose between following the law and helping my grandmother. He paused, looking back at Mrs. Chen, who smiled encouragingly. But thanks to Judge Thompson and Mr. Patterson, I learned something important. I learned that when we help each other, we make everything better for everyone. It's like... He pulled out his now famous notebook. I've been keeping track of all the good things that have happened. Would you like to hear some of them? The mayor nodded, and the boy began to read. Mrs. Lee, who got help with her diabetes medicine, now teaches other seniors how to cook healthy meals on a budget. Mr. Rodriguez, who received emergency food assistance, started a weekend soccer program for kids while their parents attend financial planning workshops. The high school students who started tutoring have helped 15 kids improve their grades, and 3 of them now want to become teachers. He continued, page after page, documenting the web of connections and support that had grown from that first act of compassion. The council chamber was silent, many eyes glistening with tears. But the most important thing, he concluded, is that nobody feels ashamed anymore. When people come to the bridge now, they know they're not just getting help, they're becoming part of something bigger. The mayor stepped forward, visibly moved. What began as a simple court case has shown us what's possible when we prioritize community healing over punishment, when we choose to build bridges instead of walls. She held up the document. This resolution will establish community support centers based on the bridge model in every district of our city. Each center will combine food security, health services, financial education, and youth employment opportunities. But more importantly, each will embody the spirit of neighbors helping neighbors that has made the bridge such a success. Mr. Patterson stood to speak next. When I first called the police about a 10-year-old shoplifter, I thought I was doing my duty as a business owner. I never imagined it would lead to completely reimagining what a neighborhood store could be. He turned to address the boy directly. You didn't just change your own life, you helped me understand what community really means. The store had indeed been transformed. The community space was now officially recognized as a satellite location for multiple social service agencies. The health clinic had expanded to weekly sessions, with volunteer doctors and nurses providing basic care and preventive services. The youth employment program had grown to include job training for adults, and the matched savings program had helped several families start building financial security. Judge Thompson approached the podium next. In my 20 years on the bench, I've learned that true justice isn't just about applying the law, it's about understanding the human story behind each case. This young man's story reminded us that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply showing people they're not alone. He pulled out his own notebook, the one where he'd written down the boy's question about dominoes months ago. This case has changed how we approach juvenile justice in our courthouse. We now have a program that connects families with resources before they reach a crisis point. The number of juvenile cases has dropped by 30% in just 3 months. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly watching from her seat, was asked to speak. She stood slowly, her arthritis much improved with proper treatment, but her movements still deliberate. "When my grandson was caught stealing," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "I thought it was the worst day of our lives. I was sure I would lose him to the system, that my failure to provide for him would cost us everything." She paused, gathering herself. Instead, that day showed us that we were never alone. It showed us that asking for help isn't weakness, it's how we build strength together. Now, I help other grandparents and parents understand this. When they come to the bridge feeling ashamed or afraid, I tell them my story. I tell them about my grandson, who turned a mistake into a miracle. The city council members listened intently as more community members shared their stories. The owner of the local hardware store talked about starting a home repair workshop for seniors. A retired teacher described the tutoring program that had blossomed in the Bridges community space. A former recipient of food assistance explained how she now coordinated the store's Pay What You Can program. As the evening drew to a close, the mayor signed the resolution, officially establishing the Bridge model as a citywide initiative. But perhaps more significant than the formal document was the conversation happening in the back of the chamber, where the boy was showing a newly arrived family around. "See this notebook," he was saying, holding up his carefully maintained record. "Every time someone gets help here, they end up helping someone else. It's like a chain of good things that keeps growing. Would you like to be part of it?" The family's teenage daughter, who had been staring at the floor, looked up with the first glimmer of hope. Could I maybe help with the tutoring program?" The boy smiled, already turning to a fresh page in his notebook. "Let me show you how it all works," he said, beginning to write down yet another link in the chain of community transformation that had started with his simple act of love for his grandmother. 1 year had passed since that transformative day in Courtroom 3. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, much like it had on that fateful day, but this time, the chamber was filled with a different kind of energy. The room was packed with community members, city officials, and news crews, all gathered for a special ceremony. Judge Thompson stood at his bench, looking out at the familiar faces that had become part of this remarkable journey. In the front row sat Mrs. Chen and her grandson, both dressed in their best clothes, just as they had been a year ago. But everything else had changed. 1 year ago, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of memory. A case came before this court that seemed simple on the surface. A 10-year-old boy caught stealing food. But what unfolded in this courtroom that day sparked a transformation that none of us could have predicted. He gestured to a large screen where photographs began to appear, the bridge in its early days, the first health clinic, young people working at Mr. Patterson's store, community members helping each other. Each image told part of the story that had captured national attention. Today, he continued, we're not just celebrating the success of one community program. We're celebrating a fundamental shift in how we understand justice, community, and the power of compassion. The boy, now 11, sat tall beside his grandmother. His notebook, now filled with hundreds of stories of community connection, lay open on his lap. Mr. Patterson, standing nearby, placed a proud hand on his shoulder. The bridge model has now been implemented in 12 cities across the country, the judge announced. Early reports show significant decreases in juvenile crime rates, improved community health outcomes, and stronger neighborhood connections. But statistics don't tell the whole story. For that, I'd like to call forward someone who has been documenting the human side of this transformation. The boy walked to the podium, carrying his notebook. A year of working at the store and helping others had given him confidence, but he still maintained that thoughtful demeanor that had touched so many hearts. "When I started keeping this notebook," he began, "I just wanted to remember how one mistake could lead to good things. But it became something bigger. It became a record of how people help each other, and how that help keeps spreading." He opened to a well-worn page. "Remember the family that came in that first month? Their teenage daughter started tutoring younger kids. One of those kids just got accepted to a special science program. His mom was so happy, she started a weekend meal program for other families. 3 of those families now volunteer at the bridge." The boy continued, tracing the connections that had grown exponentially over the year. Each story led to another, then another, creating a tapestry of community support and transformation. Mrs. Chen, who now coordinated the senior outreach program at the bridge, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her grandson speak. The woman sitting next to her squeezed her hand in understanding. It was the mother from that desperate family who had first come seeking help, now a community leader herself. Mr. Patterson stepped forward next. His store had become a model for socially conscious business practices, and he had mentored other store owners in implementing similar programs. "A year ago," he said, "I thought shoplifting was a simple issue of right and wrong. Now I understand that behind every act of desperation is a story, and behind every story is an opportunity to build something better." The mayor approached the podium, holding a document that would further expand the program's reach. "The bridge has shown us what's possible when we choose understanding over punishment, community over isolation. Today, we're announcing a statewide initiative to implement this model in communities across our state." But perhaps the most powerful moment came when a young girl, about the same age as the boy had been a year ago, stood up to speak. She had been one of the first children to benefit from the Kids Helping Kids vitamin program. "Before the bridge," she said, her voice clear and strong, "my mom used to cry at night because she couldn't afford my asthma medicine. Now she helps other parents learn about the programs that helped us. And I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up, so I can help at the health clinic." Judge Thompson returned to the podium for the ceremony's conclusion. "1 year ago, in this very courtroom, we saw how justice could be more than punishment. We saw how one act of compassion could ripple out to touch countless lives. But most importantly, we learned something profound from a child's wisdom." He turned to the boy. "You asked us about dominoes falling in a good way. You showed us that when we help each other, that help multiplies. You turned a moment of crisis into a movement of change." The judge held up a new plaque that would hang in the courthouse lobby. It read, "Justice through community, the bridge to a better tomorrow." Below these words was a quote from the boy's original courtroom statement: "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of caring." As the ceremony concluded, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans for future initiatives. The boy stood with his grandmother, watching the connections continue to form and grow. "Grandmother," he said softly, "remember when you were worried about losing me that day in court?" Mrs. Chen nodded, drawing him close. "Instead, we gained a whole community," he said, gesturing to the room full of people whose lives had become intertwined with theirs. Outside the courthouse, the city had begun construction on a new community center based on the bridge model. The old courtroom where this story began would soon be renovated to include a youth mentoring program, where young people who made mistakes could find guidance and support instead of punishment. As people filed out of the ceremony, they passed a wall of photographs documenting the bridge's first year. In the center was a picture from that first day, a nervous boy standing before a judge, not knowing that his mistake would lead to a movement. Beside it hung his first notebook, open to the page where he had written those prophetic words about dominoes falling in a good way. The last person to leave the courtroom that day was Judge Thompson. He paused at his bench, remembering the moment 1 year ago when he had chosen to see beyond a simple case of shoplifting to the human story beneath. In his hand, he held the boy's latest notebook entry, which would join the permanent display. When we help each other, we don't just solve problems, we build bridges. And bridges don't just connect people, they show us the way to a better future.